Today we're going to talk about fermentation. Now I hear some of you think right away, like really fermentation? I thought this was about distillation. And yeah, it is, but in order to distill something you first need to create alcohol. In order to make a whiskey you need to make a beer. For a brandy you need to make wine. For rum you need to make, what do we call it, rum wines? At least we need to ferment something from nothing into an alcohol-containing beverage that we can now distill and concentrate. Okay, if you make GNS or liqueurs or bitters, maybe you buy in grain-neutral spirit, you don't need to ferment. But if you want to make brandy, rum, whiskey and vodka, you basically need to create alcohol first. And that is a tremendously amazing and tremendously important step in the whole spirits production process. Mashing, fermenting, distilling, aging, bottling, selling. Maybe fermentation is the most important one in the making process, the making part of that whole process. And that's a weird conception that I think we touched upon briefly in another video, but let's do it again to make sure we hammer it home. Fermentation is not just where you create your alcohol. Fermentation is also where you make around 80, maybe 90% of your flavors. Or if you want to make vodka, where you limit the production of the amount of flavors you want to make. Distillation concentrates those flavors and cuts out or highlights certain other flavors. But all of those flavors and all of those alcohols are created during a process called fermentation. Now, we will have a series about fermentation that consists of two parts. One part will talk about how yeast, a microorganism, will actually eat or consume fermentable sugars, turn them into alcohol, and in that process, given certain circumstances, also create certain flavors. What I want to dive into today is basically that flavor composition process. How does flavor composition work? And it is tremendously important because if you want to make a great rum or a great whiskey, needs to have the right flavors. Now you can cut out some during distillation, but something that isn't there you can't add. So fermentation is critical. Fermentation is key to you as a craft distiller because, as I said before in an earlier video release, even with the economies that we bring to the market with iStill, you're still not going to be able to compete with big alcohol on liter price, on costing. They've got the advantage, so much so in terms of, well, in terms of economies of scale, that you'll probably never hit that. So we need to outcompete big alcohol by making more flavorful, better product, quality. And if flavors are for 80–90% created during fermentation, I want to explain to you how that works so that you can not only understand it, but also apply it and create the flavors that you're actually looking for. As you can see, I wrote down a formula, basically a chemistry formula. I didn't sort of invent this. It's just a description of how certain things interact with each other in the chemical world. And if I read it out aloud, it basically says esterification is the result of alcohol and organics mixing and mingling given a certain pH value, a certain temperature, and a certain time. Now that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you, so let's explain it and then use this formula because this formula is explanatory to everything that happens or everything that you want to happen or that you want to bring under control during the fermentation of your beer or your wine prior to distillation. Esterification is basically the formation of flavor molecules. An ester is another word for a flavor molecule. So this formula basically tells us how we can create a flavor molecule. We create a flavor molecule out of an alcohol molecule and an organics molecule. It's that simple. We need to put those two together, preferably in a liquid environment so they can meet and mingle. And when they meet and mingle, they automatically will form esters. Not just any esters and not just at any speed. The fun thing is that we can influence the flavors we want to get, intensity, and the balance between them by looking at a few other factors. pH, I always use the word sourness or sweetness. I think there are better words in the English language. pH basically is a scale with 7 at its mean, and if you go down to 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the solution, the liquid, becomes more and more sour. If you go up from 7, which is neutral, to 8, 9, 10, 11, exponentially, more and more sweet. A plus O creates esters times minus pH. There's a very little minus there, but there is a minus there. It's important that you read it correctly, at least for those that studied, and actually studied chemistry. So basically the formula learns us that not only do we need alcohol and organics present in order to be able to make flavor molecules during fermentation that we then concentrate during distillation, but in a more sour environment, so lower than that 7 we just spoke about, we accelerate the esterification process. So the more sour we go, the more esters we produce. Now that's an important one, right? Because if you ferment, you've got these pH measurement rods, you just put it in and you can see that your fermentation sits at 6, which is a little bit under neutral. And maybe a day later, it sits at 5, and all of a sudden you realize that your pH is dropping. Is that a good thing? Well, maybe, because a lower pH creates more flavor molecules. But what if you are making a vodka? Maybe you don't want to have that drop in pH during your fermentation, because if you do get a drop in pH, you get more flavor, and vodka is about purity, about less flavor. We want a more pH neutral fermentation. See where this is going? We're not telling you how to ferment. We're giving you a toolbox that you can apply in order to create the spirits that you need to make, that you want to make. pH. This one, time and temperature, or temperature and time. Let's say we start with temperature. In general, chemical reactions speed up at higher temperatures. As a rule of thumb, every 10 degrees Celsius, higher temperature, the amount of chemical reactions that take place basically double. So if we apply that to this formula, simply by looking at the T for temperature, this means that if we want to create more flavors, we basically need to ferment at higher temperatures. If we want less flavors, go for lower temperatures. So let's say 20 degrees Celsius room temperature is an okay fermentation temperature. Be careful, because bigger ferments warm up very quickly by themselves, so you may need to check that, to cool that, to make sure it stays at 20 degrees. Depending on the yeast strain you use, you'll create a pretty neutral flavor profile as far as temperature is concerned. And maybe as far as pH is concerned, if you keep it close to 6, close to 7. If with the same substrate, let's say grain, if with the same yeast strain we use higher temperatures than 20 degrees Celsius, so all the rest stays the same, higher temperatures, let's say we ferment at 30 degrees Celsius, that's like what it is right now here in the midst of summer, pretty warm, we'll see that more esters are formed, and basically 10 degrees Celsius more means double the amount of esters. So if you want to have more flavors, you go lower in pH and you go higher in temperature. Now we're almost there, right? Let's look at the last T, time. An easy one. The longer you let your fermentation go, the more esters you create. It's a simple formula, it's chemistry. If certain reactions take place, if you give them more time, more of those reactions will take place. If these reactions happen to be alcohol and organics mixing and mingling and forming taste molecules, the longer we allow a fermentation to sit, the more esters, the more taste molecules will be produced. So for a vodka, again, you want a short ferment, neutral pH, not too warm. For a whiskey, You want to go the other ways around, right? You want to create bold flavors. So let's take that as an example. Let's dive into whiskey making. And the same applies to brandy and in rum. And vodka is the same, only the other way around. You do everything reverse. So let's start with whiskey. We want a bold and flavorful whiskey. We need to have alcohol and organics present in order to create the whiskey. So one of the first questions that you need to deal with, preparing how you're going to make, planning how you're going to set up your distillery for whiskey making, is like, all right, I've got a masher, I've got fermenters, and I've got 1 or 2 stills. What am I going to do with my mashing and fermenting? Am I going to ferment on the grain, or am I going to take the grains out through a lautering process or via a lauter tun and basically ferment and then distill a clear beer? So do I leave the grains present, or do I take the grains out? Now, using this formula, your decision becomes very easy. If you want a bold style whiskey, you want as many organics present as you can. If you filter out your grain before fermentation, you basically ferment a clearer beer. There's not as many organics present, right? You took the grains out. So what happens to esterification? It goes down. If you want to have a medium flavor profile whiskey, maybe take the organics out. If you want to have a bold and very, very high flavor whiskey, like on that taste grid that we spoke about before, on a level 3 instead of a level 2, you leave the organics in during fermentation and during distillation. The longer you leave the organics in, the more esterification will take place. Makes perfect sense to me. I hope it now makes perfect sense to you. Let's continue to pH. pH and sourness. We already touched up on it, right? The more sour you go, the more flavors you create. But there is a distinction between more flavors and better flavors. We have to imagine that yeast is doing the work for us. They're converting those carbohydrates, sugars, fermentable sugars, into alcohols and doing a lot of the flavor composition for us. Now, yeast is a living organism, so if we put it in a very sour environment, if we put it in a very, very hot environment, it's going to become stressed. And the more we stress it, the more of certain flavors we get. The other video will dive into that. But for now, I want you to understand that if we push pH too low, we create such a stressful situation for the yeast that it can start to produce a lot of flavors, but very, very much off flavors because the yeast is dying and not performing in a healthy way. The fermentation may stop altogether and stall because it's too sour for the yeast to actually do anything else but cling on. It can't make alcohol, can't make your spirit, your fermentation, your beer, your wine for you anymore. So even though lower is better in terms of esters, there is a threshold that I feel that you shouldn't go below. For a whiskey, we usually advise to have a pH of around 4 to 4.8. 4 to 4.8. If you go below 4, especially with the grains present, there's going to be so much stress and pressure on those yeast cells that you're going to stress it out. If you go above 4.8, well, please know that bacteria actually can live in a fermentation that has a 4.8 or more pH. Below, they've got difficulty, except lactobacillus, but most bacteria can't survive below 4.8. That basically means that if we stay between 4 and 4.8, we have a protection against most bacteria, and we create as much flavor as we can, which is good for a whiskey. For a rum, especially since there's no grains present, and since there's some stabilizers naturally occurring in the molasses that we use as a substrate, instead of 4, you can go down as low as 3. I'm not sure you should go there because you are on the limits of the yeast surviving. But if you hit a 3.5 instead of staying at 4 like for a whiskey, totally fine. 4 to 4.8 is okay. If you want to go a bit lower on your fermentation, you can check it like twice a day and take a reading. And if you use the same protocols, the same yeast, the same substrate, it will give the same results time and again. For rum, you might even want to go a little bit lower. We're talking about whiskey, right? Doing rum at the same time. Sorry, I hope I'm not confusing you guys. Temperature. Higher temperature, more esters. So for a whiskey, the weird thing is that most whiskeys sort of follow traditionally a beer protocol. Beer as in consumer's beer. And that's because there wasn't a whole lot of information on how to ferment whiskey beer. So craft distillers of old used to turn to brewers and say like, so how do you actually brew your beer? And they would say, well, we brew our beer without the organics present because we want our customers to drink, not to sort of eat their beer and choke on the grains while they do so. It's not very pleasant to have a lot of grains in your beer. It's not pleasant to have even 1 or 2 particles of grain in your beer. So we take the organics out. The beer brewer would say, pH, we do that pretty neutral, temperature pretty modest, and we ferment for a long time. And basically we're not creating a whole lot of flavor because in beer, a lot of the flavors come from the hops. And if you use these protocols as a craft distiller, listening to a brewer, you're going to make a very one-dimensional product because no organics present, so not a whole lot of flavor. pH not too low, because that's what brewers do. You don't want your beer to be tremendously sour because sour beers are an acquired taste. And even though comparing beer to Coca-Cola, the beer may seem not very sweet, but there's still quite a lot of residual sugars in normal pilsners and other beers. Apart from the sour ones, nobody wants to drink sour beer, almost nobody. So let's keep it moderate, and temperatures, let's keep them under control. Good beer brewers are almost by definition not very good whiskey makers because they make a very bland-based product that doesn't result in esterification. For whiskey, you need the organics present, you need to push the pH down. And I challenge you, go for higher temperatures. Higher temperatures create more flavor. And then we go to time, and that's an interesting one, right? If you allow me to draw a little graph here, what we see time and again is that people that look at fermentation as a way to create alcohol say that, you know what, after around 3 days, 1, 2, 3, basically all the alcohol is created. In a normal fermentation on the grain and rum even faster, that's where most of the alcohol is created. Let's say that 8% is the maximum, and after 3 days you are at 7.8%. You can still leave it 2 days, day 4 and day 5, and now it is at 8%, but in those 2 days, those last 2 days, you only gain 0.2% of alcohol. So many distillers cut the distillation, cut the fermentation short, start a new fermentation, because in the first 2 days of another fermentation, you may go up to 6%, 6.5% already. So from a yield perspective, it makes sense to shorten your fermentation time. You need less tanks, you can go quicker, you can produce more batches in a limited amount of time. But if esterification is a result of organics and alcohol combining in a sour environment, high temperatures for a prolonged period of time, we must understand that on day 0, when we start the fermentation, there's no alcohol present yet. The alcohol takes like 3 days and a little bit more to go to 7.5%, 8%. So only from this moment onwards do we have the full alcohol potential, almost the full alcohol potential present. So if you look at esterification, if you look at the secondary goal, which as a craft distiller is actually your primary goal of fermentation, meaning to create flavors, it's not so much about the first 3 days because there's not a lot happening, because especially on day 1 and 2 there's low amounts of alcohol present. Low amounts of alcohol means low amounts of esterification. Even though not a whole lot happens on day 4 and 5 in terms of more yield in terms of alcohol, it is where over 60% of your flavor composition, your esterification, takes place. So letting your fermentation run for 2 more days creates 50, 60% more flavor. That's what you want as a craft distiller. Okay, Hope you enjoyed that. Let's dive in deeper. There's one little level that I want to add to it that really is going to shake you up. And I hope give you the tools to create amazing whiskeys and rums and brandies and vodkas. You remember the Holy Trinity, right? Heads, hearts, tails, fruity flavors, substrate flavors, rooty, nutty, and earthy flavors at the back. That you can detect front of mouth, middle of mouth, back of mouth, towards your throat. Spoke about that extensively. The amazing thing is that this model correlates directly with the Holy Trinity of distillation. We basically have three influencers: pH, temperature, and time. What do you think happens if we lower pH? Well, we get more esters, right? Yeah, we get more flavors. But the great thing is that if we lower pH, let's say we do 2 runs, 2 fermentations, same substrate, same grain or molasses. One goes at 5.5, the other goes at 4 for the whole fermentation. The lower pH will actually result in more esters that are related to tails association, to tail smearing. More rooty, nutty, and earthy flavor. So by influencing your fermentation towards a lower pH, we boost the tails associated third dimension flavors back of mouth. If we look at temperature, what we see is that the higher the temperature is, given a certain yeast strain, again, the other video will be about that. The higher the temperature is, the more of those fruity flavors, front of mouth flavors will be developed. And in a way, that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, look at a fruit brandy, that is, take Europe. This is a product from the southern part of Europe where it's warmer. Whiskies are from the northern part of Europe where the climate is much cooler and much colder. For whiskies you use grains, and let's say we use grapes or fruits. Yeah, fruits for fruit brandy. You can see how the warmer climate that is made, that is around in fruit brandy country, leads to more fruity characters in your fruit brandy, which makes total sense. So basically, instead of just handing you a toolkit to create more or less flavor, the formula is even much better than that because it allows you to influence what do you want to highlight. Imagine you go for a full-bodied, 3-dimensional whiskey. You better bring that pH down towards 4. You don't stay at 5.5 or 6, you want it down because you need to highlight that third dimension. You know what a whiskey looks like, right? Some flavor at the beginning, a lot at the middle, and a lot at the back. How do we get there? By making a very late cut during distillation to allow for a lot of the tails-associated flavors to come over in the new make spirit. But we first need to make those flavor molecules, otherwise we can't bring them over. Where we make them is fermentation, and we can make more of them by dropping the pH of your fermentation. Let's say we want a very fruity whiskey, because you remember that I spoke about whiskey, and especially how old whiskey, because the heads faction in aging, the fruity flavors in aging sort of oxidize and diminish over time. Very often whiskeys have a problem that they go down here, and that first dimension sort of starts to run away from us. It's not there anymore. How can we fix that? Well, we can barrel age, do a finishing in a port or sherry or wine barrel to bring in fruity flavors, basically from an external source, which if you look at the definition of whiskey is actually not allowed, but you know, it's practice now. What we could also do is just ferment at higher temperatures. If we ferment at higher temperatures, we will create more fruity flavors. Maybe bring it up there. Yeah, that's not really a whiskey profile, is it? No, but if you age this for 5, 6, 7 years, for a long time, as a lot of those flavors oxidize, you end up here all of a sudden instead of ending up somewhere down there. you now have a tool to actually create better products, because you can balance your flavors in intensity and on where you want them to hit, front of mouth or at the back end. Time, in general, enhances flavors, and especially the flavors in the middle. So a longer fermentation creates more esters in the middle. So if you feel you want to highlight this, you want to get a 3 instead of a 2, a longer fermentation usually helps you get there. And try it. If you're on a weekly scheme, why ferment for 5 days? If you're on a weekly scheme, you can ferment for 6 days or 7 days, right? Try it and see how it brings up the substrate, which is already a very difficult flavor to work with, because this is fruity, 30% of flavor. This is rooty, earthy, tailsy, 50% of flavor, but the substrate, the grain or the molasses or the fruit you work with, it's only 20% of the flavor. So maybe if you want to crank it up, well, now you know how to do that. Longer fermentation times. I think this is an amazing toolkit. And it may sound overwhelming because I'm just telling it like 10, 15 minutes to you. Watch the video again, let it sink in. Think for yourself, like, hey, I'm going to make a vodka. What do I need to do in order to get there, right? It's easy. Less esters, so maybe take the organics out. Make sure this stays pretty neutral, 5.5 at 6. Not too high temperatures, otherwise I get those fruity flavors that, hey, we spoke about, we actually don't want in our vodka. And depending on where I want to be, can I try something to make that fermentation a bit shorter? Not get the maximum flavor out, because then I have to sort of filter it out afterwards. And if we don't need to do that, why the extra work, why the extra money expenditure? And you can do this now for yourself. Just take a product, take a tequila, take a mezcal, take something I didn't talk about yet, and go through this formula. And imagine yourself making that product and making decisions on the flavor profile you want to make. Or you remember those tests that you were doing, right? On whiskey, on fruit brandy, on vodka. You remember how we tasted that product together and it had a mistake there or here. It didn't have enough three-dimensionality. It had too much at the front. The middle part didn't shine as it should. Try and reason with yourself or with a partner that maybe did a tasting with you. Like, okay, if we apply this formula, what should I change if I want to make this product, but want to make it perfect? Not just talking distilling, talking at the start of the process of formation of flavor molecules, fermentation. And that's all I have to say about esterification for now. Thank you.